Let's talk about a subject that's just surrounded by stereotypes. Who actually watches pornography? Now, you probably think you have a pretty good idea, right? Well, today we're going to push all those assumptions aside and just follow the data. And what it shows us is a reality that is way more interesting than you'd expect. So I want you to picture the typical user. Who do you see? I'm guessing it's probably a young guy, right? Just endlessly clicking from one site to the next. But is that really the whole story? Turns out the real picture is so much more complex and, frankly, a lot more surprising. For the longest time, researchers just had to, ask people what they did. And you can imagine how that goes. With all the social stigma, those self-report surveys are just full of bias and people definitely underreport. But this explainer is based on a study that used something totally different: actual web tracking data. This stuff is objective, it's anonymous, and it shows what people really do, not just what they say they do. It gives us a much clearer, totally unfiltered look at reality. All right, so with this powerful new data in hand, it's time to put some of those common stereotypes to the test. And we're going to start with how people consume this content. The big assumption is that users are like digital explorers, right? Constantly on the hunt for something new, something different. But is that what's really going on? Well, the study's findings point in the complete opposite direction. It turns out this behavior isn't exploratory at all. It's all about routine. People are, for the most part, creatures of habit who just stick to what they already know and like. In fact, get this, nearly half, a full 46% of users visited only one single adult website over the entire 3-month study. That is not exploration, my friends. That is straight-up brand loyalty. And this idea of market concentration just hammers that point home. The huge majority of traffic goes to just a tiny handful of dominant platforms. I mean, it makes sense, right? These big sites have so much content that users don't really feel the need to go anywhere else. They find a routine and they just stick with it. And that routine even extends to the time of day people are watching. We see these really clear patterns: a peak in the morning and then another long stretch in the afternoon and evening. There are also these really obvious dips, a huge one in the middle of the night, no surprise there, but also this interesting drop right around midday, which lines up perfectly with a typical lunch break. Okay, so we've got a handle on how people are watching, but what about who is watching? Again, the stereotype says it's just young men, but the real demographic data tells a much, much more nuanced story. Okay, so yes, men are the primary consumers. The data totally confirms that part of the stereotype. But look closer at the numbers for women. It's not some tiny fraction. Female viewership is way more substantial than people think. It's a really significant minority that you just can't ignore. And it gets even more interesting when you start breaking it down by country. You see these huge variations. Like in Spain, almost 30% of users are women, while in Germany, that number is much, much lower. This really suggests that cultural factors and different societal norms around gender and sexuality are playing a major role here. And the young part of the stereotype? Yeah, that's not exactly right either. Sure, younger people are watching, but consumption is present across all age groups, and it actually peaks for people in their 30s. So it's definitely not just a young person's game. People stay engaged well into middle age before it starts to decline.
And that brings us to our final and maybe the most surprising question of all. Does your political ideology have anything to do with whether or not you watch pornography?
So at first glance, the answer is no. When you just ask people where they fall on the political spectrum, left versus right, there's no real difference. People who say they're conservative and people who say they're liberal consume it at pretty much the same rates. So on the surface, it seems totally non-political. But, and this is a big but, if you dig a little deeper and you stop looking at what people say they believe and instead look at their actual media habits, a subtle but statistically significant difference starts to appear. To get this, we have to understand a metric they used called net partisan skew, or NPS. It's actually pretty simple. It's just a score that measures the political leaning of the news you read. A negative score means you read more left-leaning news, a positive score means more right-leaning news, and a score near 0 means your news diet is pretty balanced, pretty centrist. And here is where that difference shows up. It turns out that non-users, on average, have a news diet that skews just a little bit to the left. But pornography users, their average score is way closer to 0. Their news diet is more ideologically balanced, more centrist. Now, the difference is small, I'll grant you, but it is statistically significant. It's real. So, After digging through all this data, what's the takeaway? Well, those simple, easy stereotypes we started with, they've been completely replaced by a much more complex and, I think, much more accurate picture of reality. So let's just quickly recap the myths we busted today. First, behavior. It's not random exploration. It's all about routine and brand loyalty to a few big players. Second, demographics. It's not just young men. The audience is diverse in age and gender, and that changes a lot depending on the country. And third, ideology. It's not tied to how you identify politically, but there is this subtle link to having a more centrist news diet.
At the end of the day, this is what objective data can do. It can totally reshape how we understand human behavior. This one study shattered decades-old assumptions about one specific activity, and that really leaves us with a final, bigger question. What other parts of our world are we completely wrong about, just waiting for the right data to come along and show us the truth?